Good afternoon and welcome to the Europe Center. My name is Christophe Crombez and I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Jane Gingrich. She's professor of comparative political economy in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. So she's talking to us all the way from England. Unfortunately, she couldn't be with us here on campus today, but we are very happy that she is here anyway. Her research, Jane's research, focuses on the politics of education and welfare policies and on the politics of shifting policy in response to changing economic and political alignments. She's the principal investigator of a major ERC research grant, and she's also completing a book project on social democratic parties. Today, she's going to talk about the decline of the left, the decline of social democratic parties, particularly in Europe. The title of the talk is New Political Geography of Skills and Dilemmas for the Left. Just a couple of practical points. So Jane will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will have some time left, 20-25 minutes for Q&A. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And when Jane is done with her presentation, then I will go through the questions that you have entered in the Q&A section. So that also means that you can already fill out your question or enter your question while Jane is speaking, and I will just come to the questions then when we start a Q&A session. That being said, I'm very happy to give the word to Jane.
Great, thank you so much. Hold on, so I'm just going to open up my slides. Okay, and you can see these?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to present this work. It is a sort of an intersection of two parts of my research agenda right now, which is on education and social democratic parties. And it's so I'm really excited to get the feedback and to have the chance to hear what people think about this. Okay, so as everyone likely knows, social democratic parties in Europe have faced difficult electoral fortunes over the last years. And so there's been recently a small rebound, but from around the 90s to present, social democratic parties have lost substantial numbers of voters. And we can see that this decline has been particularly sharp from the 2000s. On the flip side, challenger parties on both the left and the right have increasingly picked up voters. Now, this decline is somewhat puzzling because when we look at the individual level, voters are generally positive towards a lot of things that social democratic parties stand for. They tend to exhibit limited support for austerity. They're supportive of spending. Work by Celia Hauserman and a number of collaborators shows that traditional social democratic parties, when you go out, policies, pardon me, when you go out and survey voters, are actually fairly popular. People like aspects of labor market regulation, pensions, and so on. But in the last 2 decades, these parties have nonetheless lost substantial number of voters and have experienced a particularly sharp decline in the initial period after the financial crisis. And one of the arguments that comes out of sort of the literature on the changing sort of political economy and its intersection with voting is that structural changes in the knowledge economy, the rise of the knowledge economy and associated structural changes have created a number of dilemmas for the left that have made it harder for them to maintain or retain their voters. And at the heart of many of these diagnoses are structural changes in the geography of the knowledge economy. And that's what I want to talk about in today's talk. Okay, so if we look at the literature from the United States, and I'm really drawing quite heavily here on Jonathan Rodden's work, which looks to sort of theorize this intersection between sort of political economy and realignment. There's a number of claims that are advanced about the American context. So first, that we're seeing substantial skill and racial realignment in voting, with a growing sort of gap between the educated voters with higher education and others in terms of voting for the left. This skill-based realignment coincides with a rise of a sort of economic models that privilege and concentrate skilled work in urban areas. And so skilled workers are voting more for the left, and they're living more in cities. And that majoritarian electoral systems magnify these differences. And according to Rodden, this creates a real dilemma for the left, because they're overrepresented in cities in the sense that their voters are sort of piled up in similar geographic areas, which means that they're sort of underrepresented in terms of seats in national elections. So do these same dynamics hold in the European context? So if we look at sort of skill and racial realignment in voting, is that happening? I'm not going to talk about that this much today, but in fact, there's a whole variety of evidence that suggests there's many similar trends in terms of European voting publics, and that we're seeing growing skill gradients, education gradients in voting. What about this sort of idea that there's a increasing model of political economy that concentrates workers in cities? And that's what I am going to talk about today for the first sort of 10 or 15 minutes of this talk. And the answer here is it really varies. In some European countries that's happening, in some it's not. And this, I'm going to argue, creates different dilemmas for the left. And then third, what about this sort of majoritarian penalty to the left in which you concentrate voters in cities? That clearly doesn't hold in most European cases, because in most of Europe, there's the use of a proportional systems that don't penalize geographic concentration of voters. So what this talk is trying to do is build on some of my sort of broader work to kind of conceptualize how these sort of spatial dilemmas play out for the left and create distinct forms of trade-offs electorally in the more proportional and more sort of regionally varied skill environments across European political economies. So what I want to argue is that there's basically kind of two dilemmas for the left, what I call a fragmenting and a modernizing dilemma. In the knowledge-intensive regions where we see the growing concentration of skills that looks in this sort of stylized way, like the US context where we have these superstar cities, what we see is that social democrats increasingly face competitors on both the left and the right that make it very hard for them to create cross-regional coalitions, and they bleed voters in different directions. In less knowledge-intensive regions, we see much lower skill gradients, urban skill gradients, much more dispersed support for the left. But here, the left faces the challenge of, in many cases, sort of a lack of economic opportunities that create backlash in cities. And so we see these sort of two distinct models of fragmentation of left support. And that what I hope to convince you of today is that these geographic dilemmas exist even in a proportional system, but they play out quite differently than in the US case. Okay, so I'm going to start with a discussion of kind of just some data, some descriptive data on urban-rural inequality, then look at changing voting behavior, and then I'm going to come back to the broader implications. So let's start with this geography of skills. So to what extent do we see some of the dynamics that we are witnessing in the US in terms of agglomeration economies and the sort of concentration of skills in urban areas? To what extent is that a sort of US specific story, and how much does it travel elsewhere? So the European literature on sort of urban environments and skills suggests there's quite a lot of heterogeneity, but we actually don't have really good measures of the spatial distribution of skills that are sort of cross-national, cross-time, that allow us to sort of get at that. So part of the sort of broader research project is to develop these kinds of measures. And so what we've been building is a data set of regional human capital, which tries to come up with consistent cross-time, cross-sectional measures of the distribution of skills, which we can then match to voting behavior. And so the core question initially is just a descriptive question, like what does the spatial distribution look like across European countries? So with two collaborators, Dan MacArthur and Minea Cubias, we've constructed this database of regional human capital across 17 European countries, plus the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So what do we do? So I don't want to go too far into the weeds of European local geography, but if you think about it, sort of the European Union has a typology of geography that starts at these very localized levels called a local area unit, which is like a town. In France, there's 30,000 of them. In Germany, there's 11,000. In Italy, there's 8,000, and so on. And then you move up to the next level, which are called NUTS regions, which are sort of slightly larger units. And so a NUTS 3 would be like an Italian province, and then a NUTS 2 would be an Italian region. So we gather data at this really localized level, the local area unit, using census data and administrative data, and try for at least one observation point in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s to develop measures of skills at this very localized level. We then link these up to different regional characteristics. We then measure urbanization in a variety of ways. So we link these local area units to the OECD's categorization of functional urban areas, which are like commuter zones, which have the advantage of being sort of a common definition across countries. But we also can use population density or distance to the city hall, other kinds of measures of urbanization. What we then do is measure education in as consistent a way as possible. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is just this measure, the share of people with college degrees, so university degrees. And what I want to see is like, what does the spatial distribution of these skills look like when we go really drill down to these local areas and then kind of aggregate up to different kinds of urban or conurbation or sort of broader urban areas. Okay, so to just show you this in really brief form, these are the data mapped out for these countries in 1990. And these are the data in the mid-2010s. And you can see, of course, it's much darker in the mid-2010s. That's a massive skill upgrading in Europe as everywhere else. And you can see substantial heterogeneity of both across countries. So some countries have much higher levels of people with these skills than others, but also within. And you can sort of see some of the urban areas kind of popping out, like London or Paris and so on. Okay, so does this mean there's a growing sort of urban clustering of skills? So on aggregate, when we just look across all of these 15 countries, the answer is yes. So if we look at this, this is just taking on the x-axis population density at this local area unit. So this is how densely populated the place is. And then on the y-axis, the share with the degree. And these three lines each demonstrate a decade. So this is the 2010s, the 2000s, and the 1990s. And what we can see is we move from more rural areas, less dense, to the most dense areas. They're more skilled, but the slope of this gradient has really increased over time. So this gradient in the 2010s is much sharper than in the 1990s. Now, it's less sharp in continental Europe than in the Anglo countries. This is Britain, the US, Australia, and Canada. Here, there's an even sharper urban gradient, but it's still there. So on aggregate, yes, we're seeing some of this sort of clustering of skills in cities that we see also in the United States and elsewhere. Okay, but there's huge differences in the extent of this urban gradient that vary nationally. And so to just show you this is the second definition of cities. So this is using the OECD's functional urban area categorization, where we can compare major cities, the suburbs of major cities, mid-sized cities. So this is like Toulouse or Constance or Oxford, where I live, and rural areas and towns. And then mapping again over the decades, the share of people with a college degree by this type of urban area. And what you can see is, like, in a country like Denmark, Copenhagen, which is the only major city in Denmark by this classification, just becomes much more skilled than it has just a much heavier concentration of the highly skilled within the city than in other parts of the country. So you get quite a large gradient. Whereas in Italy, actually the urban rural gradients aren't that big in comparison to other places. And I'm going to come back to the Italian case in a moment, because you say regional inequality is low in Italy, that sounds odd. But what we're going to see in Italy is like, it's because cities are quite different in terms of the way they look. So the key takeaway here is just there's a lot of variation across Europe in terms of these urban-rural gradients. Okay, so what's driving this variation? Well, it's a product of essentially three things, which is the national political economy, the regional political economy, and the structure of cities. And I'm going to talk to each of those briefly. And also, if I'm talking too fast or if you have questions, just flag me down, because I apologize. There's a lot of descriptive data here. Okay, so what do I mean by the national political economy, the regional political economy, and the structure of cities? So the first thing is, and I'll talk through this slide in a moment, but just to take a step back from it, the first thing is countries vary in a whole variety of ways that shape the concentration of skills. So some countries like Germany or Austria continue to have high numbers of people that go through vocational training and have models of economic production that are more deconcentrated. So you have people with skills that are existing across place, but they may not be necessarily college degree holders. You have other countries where the overall level of skills is lower. So just there maybe fewer people go through higher education in general. And those also tend to sort of reduce the sort of absolute urban gradient to skills, because you just have fewer people with a college degree. So by contrast, other countries have economic models in which there's sort of a high level of skilling, and there's strong incentives for people with skills to relocate into particular geographic areas. And those end up sort of concentrating skills, usually in cities. So this sort of national model of political economy varies in terms of sort of how the skills are sort of filtered through geographically. Now, what this chart is kind of showing you is that variation in a different way than the urban-rural chart that I showed you a moment ago. So what we do here is we take the local area at the 90th percentile of the skill distribution and at the 10th percentile of the skill distribution, and we're sort of plotting where the skills are over time. And so what you can see is where these gaps are bigger, that means that there's sort of a greater concentration, there's a greater inequality in the distribution of skills in the country than where these gaps are smaller. So this is Australia, a big gap between the 90th and the 10th percentile. And then next to this is Austria. There's still a gap, but it's a much smaller gap because both the overall level of people with college education is lower in Austria because of the vocational training system, and also the distribution of those people is flatter. So we see the national political economies are either concentrating or diffusing skills in very different ways. Now, this combines with what's happening locally. And I'm going to talk about this index on this slide quite a bit in this talk, so I'm going to go through it in a moment. But just to set this up, if you're thinking about, for instance, a regional political economy, you can think of the example of Michigan versus where you are in Northern California. So cities in the city of Detroit looks very different than San Francisco, not just because Detroit is structured differently than San Francisco, but because the regional political economy in which it's embedded is quite different. One manufacturing based or historically manufacturing based, the other more technology based. And the same is true with Europe's regions. They're very highly varied in terms of the sort of underlying structure of production and what they do. And this variation exists at this high level, the country, which I just talked about on the previous slide, but also at the regional level. So to try and get a sense of this regional variation, I developed this index at the NUTS2 level. So this is like a much higher unit than the ones we were using before. But what I do is I take three indicators: patents per 100,000 people, the number of people with a college degree, so the same measure that I've been talking about before, but at a higher level of aggregation, and employment in financial and business services. And I put these into an index of, which I'm calling a sort of a knowledge economy index, and map this out at the NUTS2 level. So that's that higher level of aggregation. And what we can see here is a again, a lot of variation within country in terms of these index. So we have these places with very high intensity of knowledge production. This would be London in the UK or Stockholm in Sweden. And then you have other countries like Portugal that are kind of scoring lower on this index across all regions, but still have some that are much more intensive than others. Okay, so if we take these knowledge intensive regions, what we see within them is that the urban rural skill gradient is just much higher in knowledge intensive regions. So what I'm doing here is I'm regressing local area skills on knowledge intensive regions so I'm running this within country. It's just basically a descriptive analysis. And the point here is on the x-axis is the knowledge index. So this is at the regional level, and this is the predicted value at the local level of skills. And it's kind of a complicated chart, but the key takeaway is just this, that in more knowledge intensive areas, the gap between cities and rural areas is just much larger than in less knowledge intensive regions. And so what's really happening is places that are specializing in these knowledge intensive type of production, they're ending up with these growing urban rural gaps and this sorting of skilled people into urban areas. And then the final thing that I want to point out, so I talked about the national political economy, the regional political economy, is the structure of cities themselves really vary. And I just want to show you kind of two city pairs to give you a sense of this. So this is Milan and Naples, two cities in Italy. Both of them have, if you look at the inner city, which is these blue circles, these are like the inner boroughs of Milan and the inner boroughs of Naples. We can see that as you move closer to the city center, you have more educated, more skilled people. And then as you move out in Naples, there's a gradient that sort of the skill distribution kind of drops off. Naples looks very different. You also have an educated core, but then as you move out into the suburbs, you actually have the gradient going in the other direction. And so there's also sort of people that are sort of moving out of the city center, the highly educated in the suburbs, and just the overall level of education or skills is lower in Naples than in Milan. So the urban structure looks quite different. And so Milan's relationship to its regional political economy in Lombardy looks different to Naples' relationship to its regional political economy in Campania. And we see the same with Paris, for instance, and Marseille. So Paris, really sharp skill gradient. Inner city Paris, very highly educated. There are some low education suburbs near Paris, but then as you sort of move out further from Paris, the overall level of skills goes down. Whereas in Marseille, you have a sort of a inverted U shape type relationship. As you move further out, you have some highly educated suburbs, and then very far out, more sort of lower income, less educated suburbs. So what we're seeing, okay, so why am I telling you all of this? What we are seeing are different models of spatial concentration of skills across countries. So both across different countries and within different countries, we see these different dynamics. So in some places, we're seeing this pattern of the sorting of the high skilled into urban areas. In others, we're not. We're seeing still a much more deconcentrated model. And this creates different inter and intra-regional dynamics. So we have these structural changes associated with the knowledge economy. They're leading in these different directions in terms of the spatial distribution of people and skills. And so the next question is, okay, so does this matter for the politics? Because I'm working on a book on the left, I'm particularly interested, does this matter for the politics of parties on the left? Okay. So this graph is just some very descriptive data that is going to sort of set up the second part of the talk where I go into the political dynamics. So what we see here is using this knowledge indicator that I had before. So that's at the higher regional level. So we're taking regions that are more like, say, the Northern California versus the Michigan regions, those types of regions, we're splitting them. And in here, what I have on the x-axis is log density. So this is just a measure for urbanization again. And what you can see is if you add up the left vote share of all left parties, so Social Democrats, Greens, Communists, et cetera, there's a pretty, what appears on aggregate to be a quite strong correlation in these knowledge-intensive regions between density and left party support. These are binned, so it makes it look tighter than it is, but it's nonetheless, there is, if we just showed the scatter, you would see the same thing. Whereas when we're looking at less knowledge-intensive regions, you can see overall support for left parties is higher, and there's a lower urban gradient. So we see what appears to be this sort of spatial reorientation in voters is seems to be linked to politics in terms of how the left is doing it in these places. But what is actually going on here? Okay. So the first thing is like, well, if these countries are mostly PR systems, and I've taken Britain out of all of these analyses I've shown you basically, so we are looking at primarily proportional systems. Like in some ways, it doesn't necessarily really matter if left voters are here or they're sort of spread out, because parties shouldn't necessarily be that responsive to this spatial distribution if it doesn't really matter where their voters are coming from. But there's sort of three reasons I think that they might be, and this is what I'm going to argue sort of creates these structural dilemmas that are quite distinct in these spatially concentrated versus non-concentrated places. So the first is that it's possible that voters' preferences are partly endogenous to the spatial concentration of skills. So if you're in a very highly skilled environment, an urban skill concentrated environment, you might have very different preferences than somebody that is in a more deconcentrated environment, or lower skilled people with lower levels of formal skills that are sort of in an outer suburb or peripheral area. It might have different preferences if they're embedded in a knowledge economy in which they're sort of linked in to this high performing urban area. So if we think that people's preferences aren't just totally individual, that there's something about space that might matter, then this spatial concentration could shape how they're behaving. The second thing is it might be easier to mobilize people if they're all living near each other versus dispersed. Now, modern technology changes that to some extent, but it's still possible that mobilization strategies will differ across place depending on how concentrated people are, even in a proportional system where there's not a kind of mechanical effect to that. And then the third thing is that these movements of people in space, so people moving into cities or out of cities and so on, may complicate sort of historic mobilization strategies by parties. And I don't have time to go into this in this talk, but another part of my work is trying to look over a longer period where spatially different parties are picking up voters. And that really varies across Europe. And so in the Northern European countries, the Nordic countries, left-wing parties historically had much more support in the countryside than, say, in Germany, where they were more of an urban-based movement. And as the sort of nature of the countryside and the nature of the city change, then those historical mobilizing strategies may become more complicated. Okay, so what I argue then is what we see is that even in proportional systems, there are new trade-offs that are created by geographic sorting. And these new trade-offs occur for basically three reasons. So the first is that new sort of skill-based alignments essentially reinforce growing kind of cultural divisions, which the academic literature has well documented in terms of new patterns in voting behavior. And so that even though voters, as they sort of move across place, there may be a strong kind of cross-regional, cross-skill group that is supportive of mainstream left policies. They don't necessarily prioritize the same types of policies. Those in urban areas may be more concerned about particular issues related to cities, housing costs, asset bubbles, urban infrastructure. Those in outer suburbs and more peripheral areas are concerned with issues having to do with support for the elderly, employment opportunities, regional support. And so that even though there's sort of some baseline agreement on tax and spending, they may prioritize different things. And what this means is that unlike the kind of skill geographic realignment that's occurring in majoritarian systems, in proportional systems, this means that parties that historically tried to pull across skill groups or across regions increasingly face fragmented geographic competition, in which they're facing different competitors in different regions. And that makes it really hard to pull together a full coalition in the same way as in the past. So to schematize this, and this is not a great picture, but to schematize the argument here is if we think about lower and higher skilled people and urban and rural voters, in the past, the mainstream left used to mobilize some kind of group around here, a mix of the urban working class and maybe the suburban working class. Increasingly, it faces new competitors up here of green parties and other left parties that are sort of picking up this portion of the electorate. And it's facing new regionally specific competitors, rural, right populist or left populist parties that are picking up this portion of the electorate. And as skill sorting is pushing the interests of these groups apart, it becomes much harder for them to pull together their constituency in the middle, and they're facing this sort of fragmenting competition on the left and the right. So to put this a little more concretely, and then I'll show you some data that tries to flesh this out, here's the example of Sweden, which is historically had one of the most successful social democratic parties, the Swedish Social Democrats. In the 1990s, they drew disproportionately from lower educated voters, and they were slightly more rural in their voting base. And their main competitors were picking up kind of the urban middle class up here. Over time, they've moved to slightly, they've faced a new competitive environment where the Sweden Democrats are now picking up voters here in rural areas with lower levels of education. They're still losing this growing share of voters up highly educated in cities, and they face sort of center-right party coming in and picking up some of the workers both within and outside of cities. And the problem is that moving to pick up one of these groups becomes very difficult without losing another. And I'm going to try and show that a little more systematically. Okay, so if we return to the kind of left urban gradient that I showed you before, that sharp gradient on sort of voting for the left in more knowledge intensive regions, what we see there is this is actually really driven by what's happening on challenger parties, not the mainstream left. So to see this, I regress different kinds of party family votes on the urban type using that knowledge, that's to knowledge index again. And I'm using country fixed effects. I'm controlling for the GDP, the log density and population, and I cluster the standard errors by country year, and everything is weighted by the population share. So it's not, these little tiny towns aren't running everything. Okay, so what do we see here? And I'm going to present 4 charts like this. So I'll talk through the first one, and then sort of the other ones will kind of follow the same pattern. So on the x-axis, we again see this regional economy score. So these are the more knowledge intensive regions, and these are the less knowledge intensive regions. This is voting for the green left parties, and these are voting for right populist parties. And then these lines are the different types of urban and rural areas. And so the yellow line is big cities, the red line is medium-sized cities, the green line is suburbs, and this blue line is like everyone else, rural and towns. So what we see is that in knowledge intensive areas, the gap between rural areas and especially big cities in voting for the green left is particularly large compared to less knowledge intensive regions. And these gaps are even bigger when it comes to voting for right populists. And so, okay, so what does this like, what's the significance of this? What these results are telling us is that these urban-rural gradients are being magnified in these knowledge-intensive areas, and that's really following from the sorting of voters into these different types of areas, from cities to rural areas into these sort of outer suburbs that look a little bit more like rural areas. So where we have these more knowledge-intensive regions, these urban-rural gradients on voting are larger than where we have less knowledge-intensive regions. When we look at the mainstream parties, these gaps are really just not there. They're much more similar in the gradients across place. So the Social Democrats do better in less knowledge-intensive regions than in more knowledge-intensive regions. But there's not, but these big gaps between types of urban and rural areas aren't as pronounced as we see with the challenger parties. And the same is true for the mainstream right. Okay, so what's going on then? What we're seeing, and this is why I'm calling it fragmenting competition, is that these processes of sorting, as these new competitors are emerging, the new competitors are kind of eating up the competitive space in rural or urban areas, and that's happening in this fragmenting way in these knowledge-intensive regions, but much less so in the less knowledge-intensive regions. To show this a little bit more systematically, I want to test this idea of fragmenting competition. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at sort of when the Social Democrats lose vote share, who is picking it up? And so I regress the vote share for the Green left parties and the right populists on the interaction between the local educational attainment, so that skill sorting measures that I had before, and the decline of social democratic voting. So essentially just think of this as like, when Social Democrats lose, what's happening to the vote share for other parties in different types of places. And so what we can see is on the x-axis, here's the education score, and I standardize it, so I'm not using the raw education score. So this is lower education than the national mean, and this is higher education than the national mean. And then on the x-axis, sorry, the y-axis, is the percentage the model predicts that populist parties over here and Green parties here will pick up as Social Democrats decline. And what we can see is that in places with lower, on average, lower levels of skill attainment, when Social Democrats lose votes, populists are predicted to gain, but they basically don't gain in the most highly educated areas when the Social Democrats lose votes, so they gain much less. Whereas Green parties, you see the exact opposite trend. When in places with lower levels of education, when the Social Democrats lose, they pick up only a small amount, and they pick up a lot more voters in places when in highly educated places when the Social Democrats lose. So what this is telling us is that there is this sort of geographic fragmentation in the competitive space around political parties, even in these proportional systems. Now, I'm a little low on time, so I'm not going to go through all the next slides. I just want to show one to get at the challenge for positioning, and then I'm going to come back right at the end to this question about the less knowledge-intensive regions. So why does this create such a problem for the left? If they have these competitive Green parties in cities, and they have populists in the center right in rural areas, like why does that create a particular structural problem for the left? The problem for them is that if they move to kind of compete in the rural areas, they can lose parts of the cities. And if they move to compete in the cities, they may not have ever had as much support in rural areas, so they may lose a little bit less if they follow that strategy. But they're nonetheless vulnerable to continuing to lose to urban competitors that are even more well-suited to urban high-skilled voters, and those are usually Green parties. So to give you just one example of this, this is the example of Denmark. Denmark is kind of a famous case in the literature on social democratic party positioning. because it moved to a much more restrictive stance in the last two elections on immigration issues in an explicit attempt to sort of try and win back some of the rural voters or populist right voters that had prioritized this particular issue. And what we see in Denmark is that this is vote share by different kinds of rural and urban areas over time. And what you can see is that the Danish Social Democrats are sort of losing voters, just like Social Democrats are everywhere. And they kind of stem those losses in suburbs and medium-sized areas, but they completely lose Copenhagen in relative terms compared to the rest of the country, as voters here defect and move more to the non-social democratic left in the face of this positioning. And this gives a sense if they move to sort of maintain these voters, they lose these ones, and if they move to pick up these ones, they may lose less here because in some cases they don't have as many voters here. But the challenge here then is maintaining these voters in the face of a more targeted urban competition, which we see with the rise of green parties in a number of cases. And I was going to show you this with Germany, but I'm just going to leave that for now because we're running out of time. So in the knowledge intensive places, we're seeing this sort of spatial distribution leading to positional trade-offs for the left in that it's very difficult for them to maintain this cross-regional coalition in the face of growing sort of sorting and geographic divides in the economic experiences of voters. In the less knowledge intensive regions, this trade-off is less pronounced. And in fact, Social Democrats have done better in many of these less knowledge intensive regions. It's like parts of Portugal and so on. They've also done quite poorly in parts of Greece where PASOK essentially collapsed. But the key thing here is that the sorting, the urban-rural gradients are not as severe in creating these sort of positional trade-offs, but they nonetheless face vulnerability to competitors in the face of strong discontent that may accompany sort of the prolonged stagnation associated with lower levels of overall skilling. And so in places where we see these sort of narrower skill gradients in terms of the geographic concentration of voters, we tend to see higher social democratic support, but in some of these countries, we've seen much more serious challengers pick up in sort of populist terms that have eaten into core areas of social democratic support, like Syriza or Podemos and so on. And so to just map this, here's a measure, again, going to the same model specification I had before, where I'm looking at the intersection between the regional knowledge economy score and the urban type and voting. And here what's interesting is that we see that it's in the lower knowledge economy places that we get these bigger gradients on voting for the radical left. And it's cities and suburbs that are sort of rebelling, not the rural areas that we saw with sort of populist voting for the right in the more knowledge intensive places. And so the threat to the left here comes from these kinds of movements. Okay, so this is my last slide. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but just to conclude. So what we're seeing, I think, or at least is that when we're looking at this sort of spatial reorientation across European political economies, is that we're seeing sort of these at least two, probably more different models. One where we're seeing this sort of economic concentration of high skilled voters in cities, and others where we're still seeing a sort of flatter pattern, but often with sort of lower overall levels of attainment. In that sorted model, that process of sorting is sort of fragmenting the coalition for the left and creating new positional challenges where it's hard for the left to simultaneously pick up the cities and keep the rural areas, but moving to one or the other still allows it to be kind of outflanked by competitor parties. In the more regionally unsorted areas, those trade-offs are less severe, but the left still faces some strong competitors where there's sort of frustration with the sort of level of economic development. And those competitors are really picking up disaffected voters in urban and suburban areas. And this means that we are seeing particular geographic challenges for the left, even in proportional systems that don't reward that. So I will stop here, and sorry for going a little bit over, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane, for this great presentation. So we have some time now. We have about 15 minutes left for a Q&A. So members of the audience, if you would like to ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. I will start out by asking a couple of questions myself. I have two questions, basically. My first question is maybe a bit of a question of clarification. So a part of your argument is that it's easier for center-left parties, for social democratic parties, to keep their coalition together, all these different factions that you were talking about, to keep them together in a context where there's not so much sorting going on. So I was wondering whether you could explain a little bit more why it is easier in such a context. And my second question is sort of more related to your views on what social democratic parties should be doing. So if you were to give strategic advice to social democratic parties, what would you advise them to do? Which voters would you advise them to go for? And or which strategies would you advise them to follow? And I'm thinking specifically also today about the French Socialist Party. We had a talk last week about French politics. And one of the questions I asked the speaker, Patrick Chamarel, then was, okay, you talked about all these candidates, but where's the center left? So it looks like France is a good example of a country where the Socialist Party, basically the Social Democratic Party, faced with these all these questions that you raised, ended up losing all the parts of its coalition. So I was wondering whether you could say a little bit about that. Those are my two questions, basically.
Yeah, so on the first question, so why is it? So I think there's sort of two things that are going on in the places with less skills oriented. The one is just that the challenge, so some of those places there, like Greece, for instance, there has been, the Social Democrats just like lost, they entirely imploded. And so it's not the case that they're sort of immune to this, but I think there's still, there are sort of two basic things going on. One is just a compositional factor, which is that the heavy concentration of new left voters who are sort of building up support for green parties is generally absent in those places. And so that's going to change over time potentially, but you don't, the big challenge in particularly in places like Germany has really been from the rise of green parties that have really sucked up the sort of new middle class voters and younger voters. And that has left Social Democrats sort of much less able to sort of cement their base. And so where there's sort of just lower supply of voters for those parties, then Social Democrats have faced less competition on that front. But secondly, I think that in some places where you have more sort of spatial continuity, it really also comes down to a degree of mobilization. And so that where the sort of traditional mechanisms of mobilization sort of still remain aligned to where the voters are, then that gives these parties more ability to continue to mobilize parts of their base. Whereas what happens in these sort of like places where you've had a lot of structural change in the places that voters live in, then it becomes increasingly these parties either underinvested in mobilization or they don't have the same links to the community, and so they've struggled to sort of rebuild some of these structures over time. And so then I think this is a tricky question in terms of what the sort of what is to be done question for Social Democrats. So my colleague Tarek Abuchadi makes a very strong argument that sort of the Danish approach of sort of repositioning on more kind of culturally conservative is the wrong one, because the nature of the competitive threat is much higher from the left than the right for social democrats. And I think I'm like 95% convinced by that argument, so that in the sense that that's what my data say as well, is that if we're thinking about sort of where social democrats are most vulnerable, it's often the defection of these urban voters, both because they generally had more of them to start out with, and because that's where the left, the green left, is sort of picking up most extensively. But there are some there is some important variation there, which is maybe what explains sort of why Denmark is a particular case, but also why Sweden, I think, would follow somewhat the same path, which is where these social democrats historically had more rural links, as they did in sort of the Nordic countries. Then they did historically have more mobilizing capacity and more voters in rural areas. And there, I think they face a different set of trade-offs that is also coming from the political or the populist right, not just the kind of green left. And so the kind of optimal strategy in that case might look somewhat different than elsewhere. In terms of the French case, it's really interesting because the French are kind of in between these sort of two cases. And I think I mean, it's very clear, and I skipped over the French slide, the slide on France by urban rural, because I was running out of time. But in France, it's just like they lose everyone, and it's so rapid, and is not coming. It doesn't look like it's coming back in this election. And so I think that there's a whole there. It may be sort of less about the spatial distribution of voters, but also the overlay of the spatial distribution of voters with sort of weak ties to the French socialists. And so when I talk about these knowledge-intensive regions and the sort of urban-rural gradients, one of the big exceptions to that pattern is actually Paris, because Paris has always had a strong center-right presence within the city. So if you map the arrondissements of Paris, there's sort of like some that look kind of like parts of Berlin, like they're highly educated, they voted for the left, or they and so on. But actually, you have a lot of those very wealthy parts that are sort of voting for the center-right historically. And then with the rise of Macron, they sort of all move in that direction. And so you're left with a sort of no ballast to that on the center left, like what a large Green Party would provide. And so the center left without the PS just is sort of not there. So you have Mélenchon gaining in some of the outer suburbs of Paris, alongside the National Front. And then you have the urban core, which in Milan or in Berlin or whatever would have a major green left presence, is just lacking in that case. And so the entire center left is hollowed out in many ways in the French case. And that to me is an interesting case, and it's hard to know now what the PS could do. I mean, I think perhaps going back, there is something, somewhat of a story about sort of investing more in mobilization and connections with voters. But positionally, I think they're clearly in a very tricky position now.
All right, thank you. I'll bring up two questions from the audience now. One technical, more technical, and one not so technical. Not so technical question is about who benefits, basically. I mean, you showed us quite well and quite convincingly that the Social Democrats pay the price for this sorting. Who is it that benefits? Is it mainly populist parties, or does it vary? Is it different in Europe from in Latin America, for example? So that's one question. And the other question is about the data and how you manage to use data from different countries, basically, and sort of compare them. Whether that was whether those data were readily available and sort of all in the same format and the same questions and so on, or whether you had quite a bit of work to do there.
Yeah, so I can answer those in the reverse. So yes, it was a lot of work. So the data was not readily available. If whoever asked that question is interested in gathering this, feel free to get in touch, because at some point we're building a website right now, and this will all be publicly available down the line. But the challenges are everything you can imagine. It's the geographic boundaries, it's getting access to the data, it's reconciling the indicators across countries, it's verifying them. So all of that was a lot of legwork. With the voting behavior, some of that's been done so that we have like higher levels of aggregation, the constituency level election archive provides that, but we want to go lower. So you have to go back to national returns and then harmonize the boundaries and harmonize the data. And that's a lot of work. And then when it comes to the education data, it was a lot of work in part because just education is measured very differently across countries, and some measure it much better than others in terms of the quality. And so just getting indicators that are relatively reliable in terms of what they're actually measuring was a huge amount of harmonization also on the sort of the measurement of the skills, not just the geography. So that was, it's taken several years. I mean, just to sort of work through it, a lot of trial and error, but I think it actually, as we add new indicators, so we're adding immigration data now, it's going much quicker in part because we already have this model. In terms of who wins, I mean, I think that there is this, sort of, I guess, different winners that come out of this. So within cities, I think that are the sort of liberal and green parties are coming out ahead. And I would not call these parties populist at all. They're very mainstream parties that are picking up higher skilled voters. And clearly some populist parties have picked up in more rural areas or outer suburbs. And so the nature of these winners varies across area within a country, and then across country, this plays out differently in part because of the spatial distribution of the population in the first place. And so I think that the comparison to Latin America is really intriguing, and I don't know enough about it to have a really strong sense of sort of how changes in spatial concentration have mattered in that case. And I would love to know more about that. I mean, it's sort of the ways in which that's sort of panned out differently in those contexts. What we can see clearly, and I think this is the case, is like within the European context, clearly there's variation across places. So I am capturing that with my knowledge index, where I sort of say like, okay, in these knowledge intensive regions, it sort of looks like this, and then less so in these less knowledge intensive regions. Those differences sort of you can map onto proper names. So they're sort of countries. And so, you know, you can say like, okay, the Nordic countries, these trends play out differently than in the continentals, and then it play out differently than in southern countries. And so there's not a sort of homogeneous set of winners and losers across Europe. But in general, based on what I've sort of shown, is that in the knowledge intensive regions, we do see again, these fragmented challengers that are systematically different across place, picking up in varying ways.
All right, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our hour together. So the only thing that is left to me is to thank you very much, Jane, for this great presentation on this important topic, fascinating topic. The decline of the left is definitely one of the mysteries of European politics in the past couple of years and even decades. So we're very happy that you were able to talk to us about that today. Our next presentation, or our next panel in that case, is a week from today. We have a panel on Hungary, Poland, and the rule of law violations there, and the EU's response to them. Very interesting, especially also in light of the Hungarian elections that took place just this past weekend. So we hope to see you all again a week from today. And thanks again, Jane, for this great hour together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.